At 94, Clint Eastwood finally speaks, and what he reveals? It shatters decades of silence, a truth buried beneath the glitz of Hollywood, a story of loyalty, betrayal, and a rivalry that cut deeper than any cowboy showdown. For over half a century, the shadow of Gene Hackman loomed over Clint, his friend, his foe, the one man who could stare him down without flinching. But why did their story remain hidden for so long? And what final secret did Clint carry that could change everything? The truth is not for the faint of heart. This is not just a tale of brotherhood. It's a tragedy, a bitter standoff between two Hollywood gunslingers who never learned how to bow. Two men born to lock eyes across a dusty street, destined to stand at opposite ends of the barrel until the very end. Clint Eastwood sat in silence by the window, his aged hands gripping the worn wooden armrest of his chair. The room was still, illuminated only by the fading golden light that stretched across the walls, casting long shadows over old photographs. Memories frozen in time. At 94 years old, every passing day felt like another page in a book ready to be turned for the last time. But today? Today, there was no new script, no Hollywood calls, no scent of old gunpowder in the air. Today, there was only silence. And that silence bore a name: Gene Hackman. For decades, Clint lived alongside silence. It was an old friend to him, a constant companion. He never dwelled on the past, never clung to old glories. But this was different. This silence was as heavy as the weight of an unloaded gun in a desperate standoff, because the man now laid to rest was none other than Little Bill Daggett. Clint and Gene were not the kind of friends who met for Sunday barbecues or exchanged birthday gifts. No, they were from a different breed of men, a generation where friendship was measured in nods, glances, and the cold steel of unspoken respect. Their connection was sealed on the set of Unforgiven, 1992, not just an Oscar-winning masterpiece, but a battlefield where their legacies clashed and intertwined. Two aging titans stepping into the ring one last time, knowing they were writing their own eulogies. At the film's premiere, Clint was 62. Gene, 62. Two old cowboys walking out of the shadows of Hollywood's golden era. They had survived too many battles, taken too many bullets, both on screen and in life. It's a hell of a thing, killing a man. William Money's words rang out like a funeral bell, haunting the men who had worn the cowboy hat long before CGI and superheroes took over Hollywood. From that day on, Clint and Gene knew. Their fates were tied together. Their rivalry? Unbreakable. But time shows no mercy. Years passed. Clint kept working, unstoppable, while Gene vanished without a goodbye. No farewell party, no final press conference, just gone. Clint called a few times. Then he stopped, because he understood. Old gunslingers don't say goodbye, they just disappear into the mist. Whenever Gene's name was brought up in interviews, Clint's eyes darkened. He was one of the best, he would say, his voice thick with something unsaid. Then he would fall into silence. What happened between them? No one knew. But what we do know is this: whenever Unforgiven was mentioned, Clint would retreat to his private room, sit beside his old guitar, and strum a few sorrowful notes. And when someone asked him if he still kept in touch with Gene, he simply smiled faintly. We had our time. But was that the truth? Or was there something deeper? Something unsaid? Something Clint wished he had told Gene before it was too late? Then, in 2015, a letter arrived at Clint's Carmel home. No return address, just 3 simple letters in the corner. G.H. The letter was discovered by Dina, Clint's ex-wife, who still checked in on the house from time to time. She placed it on his desk, next to a pile of dusty scripts. She didn't open it. She didn't need to. She knew that letter was worth more than any Hollywood deal, because it came from Gene Hackman, the one man Clint could never outrun. Inside the envelope, A yellowed piece of paper bore shaky handwriting, but it still carried the sharpness of a man who had held countless golden statuettes. No greetings, no formalities, just raw, brutal honesty. "One last ride, Clint. Just you and me. No Oscars, no press, no agents. Just us, and a story only we can tell." Clint read the letter so many times, the edges became wrinkled and torn. But he never replied. Not because he didn't want to, but because he knew. Some journeys were meant only to be dreamed, never taken. The truth is, their story didn't begin on the set of Unforgiven. It started decades earlier. Back in the 1970s, Clint was still trapped in Dirty Harry's shadow, trying to break free from the stereotype of the rogue cop. Gene? He had just won an Oscar for The French Connection. The man was untouchable. They first met at a Hollywood producer's party. No fireworks, no dramatic encounters, just two men observing each other from a distance. Clint stood in the corner, quietly swirling whiskey in his glass. Gene laughed loudly, his eyes flashing with the arrogance of a recent victor. They were polar opposites. One was silent and cold as a revolver. The other, explosive as a lit fuse. Then, in 1992, destiny brought them together again. No fanfare, no grand introductions. Just two old cowboys sharing one final cigarette before the sun set. But Clint never forgot the way Gene looked at him after their last scene in Unforgiven, when William Money turned and walked away into the rain. Gene stood there, watching him go. No acting, no script, just the gaze of a man who knew his time was ending. After that, they didn't see each other much. Dinners became infrequent. Phone calls grew rare. But the letters never stopped. Because Gene Hackman? He didn't use email. And Clint? He hated texting. Handwritten words carried a weight, a finality that digital screens could never replace. In those letters, they mocked Hollywood's cheapening standards. They reminisced about freezing on set, the endless rewrites, the bruises from stunts gone wrong. And then came the one letter that changed everything. Do you ever wonder what it would be like if we did one more? Clint folded the letter, put it in a drawer, lit a cigar, and never replied. Not because he didn't have an answer, but because he knew. The question itself was enough. Clint Eastwood never responded to that letter, but it haunted him. The words lingered in his mind, slipping into his thoughts during the quiet hours of the night. He would sit on his porch, staring at the Pacific, rolling that question over in his mind. Could they have done one more? Could they have defied time, stepped onto one last set together, and given the world something unforgettable? Or was that just the fantasy of two old cowboys who didn't know when to hang up their holsters? In 2015, Gene Hackman wrote again. This time there was no hesitation. It wasn't a question, it was an invitation. The letter was direct, unembellished, the way Gene had always been. There's a story we haven't told, Clint. The story of two men who should have been gone long ago, but somehow kept riding. Let's tell it before it's too late. Clint held that letter in his hands for a long time. He didn't need to read it more than once. He knew exactly what Gene was saying, what he was offering, but he also knew something else. Gene wasn't just talking about a film. He was talking about the ride itself. Two old souls, one last journey. But Clint declined. Not with a letter, not with a phone call. He simply remained silent. Not because he didn't want to go, but because he was afraid. Afraid that when they stood together again, all the legends would crumble. That they wouldn't be the men Hollywood remembered, but just two frail old actors trying to chase ghosts. That the world wouldn't see cowboys. They'd see two relics who had overstayed their welcome. And Gene deserved better than that. Gene understood. He didn't write another letter. But in 2019, as the years caught up with him and the weight of time pressed heavier on his chest, Gene sent one last thing to Clint. It wasn't a script. It wasn't an idea. It wasn't even an invitation. It was a small, old, leather-bound notebook. Inside, there was only one line. "We had our ride, partner. That's all that matters." Clint kept that notebook. It sat on his desk, untouched, for years. Every time he opened it, he saw Gene's handwriting, the weight of those words pressing against his ribs like a gun tucked inside a holster. They had their ride. No need for one more. But in 2023, when the news of Gene Hackman's passing reached Clint, something in him broke. The world reacted with sorrow, with tributes, with long-winded reflections on Gene's impact. But Clint? Clint said nothing. No statement, no public message, no grand tribute. He just disappeared. For a week, he vanished from the public eye, retreating to his old ranch in Carmel, where once, on a winter afternoon in 1993, he and Gene had shared whiskey and a silent understanding. No one knew what Clint did during those days. No one saw him. No one heard from him. But when he emerged, the lines on his face seemed deeper, his shoulders heavier. The last true cowboy had lost his only equal, and there was no one left to stand across from him on that dusty street. Just when the world thought Clint would remain silent, he spoke. No fanfare, no staged interviews, just a quiet, hoarse voice breaking years of silence. There was no finer actor than Gene Hackman, and no friend more important to me than him. 2 sentences, no embellishment, no excess. But those who had followed the story of these 2 men for decades knew that Clint had never said words like that about anyone. Not Sergio Leone, not Lee Van Cleef, not even his first wife. Only Gene. And then Clint did something even more unexpected. He shut off his phone, disconnected his landline, stopped answering emails. For weeks, he didn't speak to anyone. The press swarmed, desperate for more words, more insight, more of the story that Clint had never told. But they got nothing. Only one person heard his voice. Kyle Eastwood, his eldest son, was the only one Clint called. And when he did, his voice was different, softer, heavier. "We wasted too much time being stubborn old bastards." Just one sentence. No excuses, no explanations, just the weight of a lifetime of silence, of unsaid words, of moments lost in the dust of the past. Because Gene Hackman wasn't just a co-star, he wasn't just an old colleague. He was the only mirror Clint Eastwood had ever had. The only one who had ever challenged him. The only one who had ever understood him. And now, he was gone. In the days following Gene Hackman's death, Clint Eastwood became a ghost. Those close to him knew better than to ask questions. They knew that when Clint grieved, he did it in silence. But this time, it wasn't just grief. It was something deeper, something unresolved. Reporters camped outside his Carmel ranch, desperate for more than the 2 sentences he had given. Hollywood speculated wildly. Was there an unfinished script? A secret collaboration that never saw the light of day? Some final hidden truth that only Clint knew? The whispers grew louder. Some claimed there was a joint will between Clint and Gene, a secret agreement about their unfinished 2018 project. Others insisted there was one last letter Clint never sent, buried in his desk drawer, waiting for an answer that would never come. No one knew, and Clint wasn't telling. What people did know was that after Gene's passing, Clint changed. He became quieter, if that was even possible. He stopped going to meetings, stopped taking calls from old friends, stopped reading new scripts. It was as if, with Gene's death, something in Clint had finally given in to time. One evening, a journalist caught sight of him sitting on his porch, staring at the ocean, fiddling with an old silver lighter. A birthday gift from Gene in 1985. Engraved on the side, 2 words, compadre. Not friend, not brother. Just compadre. A partner. A fellow gunslinger. Someone who stood by your side, but was always ready to face off against you when the time came. The last man who had ever been that to Clint Eastwood was now gone. Hollywood responded the way Hollywood always does, by making a spectacle of death. Gene Hackman's passing became headline news. Tributes poured in from every corner of the industry. His name was splashed across magazine covers, his greatest performances replayed endlessly on late-night television. People who had never met him spoke about him as if they had known him all their lives, but the only tribute that mattered was the one Clint sent. A short, handwritten letter delivered to the Hollywood Reporter. Gene Hackman and I were never close friends, at least not by Hollywood's definition. We didn't text. We didn't invite each other to birthday parties. We argued more than we laughed. We were silent more than we spoke. But if anyone asked me, at the other end of my gun, who I most wanted to see standing there, the answer was always Gene Hackman. 4 sentences. And all of Hollywood was stunned. For decades, the world had tried to understand the connection between Clint Eastwood and Gene Hackman. Were they friends? Were they rivals? Did they respect each other? Or did they secretly despise one another? The answer was in that letter. It didn't matter what they were. What mattered was that they had each other. When people spoke about Unforgiven, they talked about the tension between them on set, the whispered rumors of near fights, the way Gene Hackman allegedly exploded when Clint changed a piece of dialogue without warning. The times Clint walked out of meetings when Gene said something that pushed too hard against his pride. But in the end, it was all part of something bigger. Richard Harris, their late co-star, once said, "They were like 2 lost cowboys. No matter how much they cursed each other, they knew they only had each other." As the tributes continued to pour in, an old photo resurfaced. It was from 1992 on the set of Unforgiven, taken in the freezing cold of Alberta, Canada. Clint and Gene standing side by side in the rain. No smiles, no forced poses. Just 2 men standing there, staring into the distance. Hollywood loves a polished, sentimental story, but the story of Clint and Gene was rough around the edges, full of tension, contradictions, and unspoken words. No dramatic reunions, no emotional speeches, just letters exchanged over decades, filled with unsaid things, just arguments over films they never made, just the quiet acknowledgement that, in the end, they were the only 2 left who truly understood each other. We don't have to like each other to know we need each other. Clint said that once, in 2004. No one thought much of it at the time. Now the world finally understood what he meant. Then, just when the media frenzy started to fade, a new rumor surfaced. A journalist claimed that hidden somewhere in Clint Eastwood's Carmel Ranch, there was a final unsent letter addressed to Gene Hackman. A letter Clint had written, but never sent. A letter that could reveal everything. In January 2024, as winter blanketed Carmel in white, Clint Eastwood sat at his old wooden table, pen in hand, staring at a blank sheet of paper. Clint Eastwood was not a man for apologies. He never begged. He never explained himself. But this letter? It was different. The ink bled slowly onto the paper, the words forming with a hesitation that had never been there before. "Gene, I guess we both thought we had more time. Turns out, all we had was Unforgiven. No long explanation, no emotional goodbye, just a single, stark truth." Clint folded the letter and slipped it into a brown envelope. But he didn't send it. Instead, he placed it in an old wooden box in the corner of the room. Inside that box were things no one else had ever seen. Scraps of old scripts that never got made. Behind-the-scenes photos from decades ago. Letters from Gene, yellowed with age. When Clint Eastwood's family found that box, after Gene's death, the letter was still there, unsent. Some things don't need to be spoken. Some apologies don't need to be heard. Some friendships are too complicated to ever be defined. That evening, Clint sat on his porch, watching the sun disappear behind the waves. No whiskey, no cigar, just silence. For the first time in decades, there was no one left to argue with. No one left to challenge him. Somewhere, in the fading light, maybe Gene Hackman was still there, still watching him, like he did in that final scene of Unforgiven. No words, no gunshots, just two old cowboys, finally learning to let go. But some whispers refused to die, because according to one source, someone close to Clint, there was something else in that wooden box. Not just Gene's letters, not just old photographs, a script Clint had written after Gene's death, a story about two old cowboys, one who walked into the sunset, and one who stayed behind, haunted by the ghost of the man he never got to say goodbye to. No one knew if Clint would ever make that film. No one knew if it would ever see the light of day. But one thing was certain. Clint Eastwood wasn't done telling his story. Not yet. Thanks for watching. If you want to see more stories, hit that like button and don't forget to hit that subscribe button. And let me know on which topic you would like to see stories next. And check out these other video you might enjoy. See you in the next one. Till then, take care and goodbye.